On a Thursday night in July 2011, at precisely 12:47 a.m., a 29-year-old night janitor named Derek Sullivan stood before a Commonwealth Bank ATM on a quiet Sydney street corner, slightly drunk, needing cash for one more round at the pub. What happened in the next 90 seconds would set in motion a 4-month criminal spree that would see him withdraw over 1.6 million Australian dollars from accounts that contained, at most, $40. This is not a story about a mastermind hacker or an organized crime syndicate. This is the story of an ordinary man who stumbled onto what investigators would later call one of the most significant security vulnerabilities in modern banking history, and then couldn't stop himself from exploiting it. It's a story about the fragility of digital systems we trust with our lives, the psychological toll of living a double existence, and the bizarre reality that sometimes confessing to a crime is harder than committing it. This is the true story of the infinite money glitch. Before we go deeper into this chilling true story, subscribe if you love investigative documentaries that explore the dark psychology behind real crimes, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Derek Sullivan's life before the glitch was unremarkable in every statistical sense. Born in 1982 in the western suburbs of Sydney, he grew up in a working-class household where his father drove trucks and his mother worked retail. He attended public schools, earned average grades, and showed no particular aptitude for technology or finance. After finishing high school without distinction, he drifted through a series of manual labor jobs, warehouse work, construction, brief stints in hospitality, before landing a position as a night janitor at the Harbourside office complex in Sydney's business district. The job paid minimum wage, offered no benefits, and required him to work alone from 10 p.m. until 6 a.m., mopping floors and emptying trash bins in the very buildings where investment bankers and corporate executives spent their days managing millions. The irony of this would not be lost on Derek later. He was, by his own later admission, tired of being invisible, tired of watching people in expensive suits walk past him as if he didn't exist, tired of checking his bank balance obsessively, calculating whether he could afford both groceries and rent in the same week. He wasn't desperate enough to consider traditional crime. He'd never stolen anything, never contemplated robbery or fraud, but he was frustrated enough to fantasize about a different life. On that July evening, Derek finished his shift at 9:30 and met friends at the Golden Anchor, a pub 2 blocks from his apartment known for cheap beer and a clientele of tradesmen and service workers. He drank 4 pints of lager and accepted 2 shots of whiskey from a co-worker celebrating a birthday. By midnight, he was pleasantly drunk, loose and talkative, when he reached for his wallet and discovered he had no cash left. The nearest ATM was mounted on the exterior wall of a Commonwealth Bank branch that had closed at 5 p.m. Derek had used this particular machine dozens of times. It was unremarkable, identical to thousands of others across Australia: a metal panel set into a brick wall, a screen, a keypad, a card slot, a cash dispenser. He inserted his debit card and navigated to the transfer menu. His plan was routine: transfer $200 from his credit card to his savings account, then withdraw it as cash to avoid the direct cash advance fees his credit card charged. He'd done this transaction many times before. He entered the amount, confirmed it, and pressed the final button. The screen blinked. Transaction cancelled. The message appeared in harsh red letters. His card ejected from the slot with a mechanical whir. Derek stared at the screen, confused. He tried again. Same result. Transaction cancelled. Card ejected. He stood there for a moment, the alcohol in his system making everything feel slightly unreal, trying to understand what was happening. Then, operating on instinct more than logic, he tried something different. He inserted his card again, selected withdrawal instead of transfer, chose his savings account, and entered $200. The machine hummed. Bills began sliding out of the dispenser. 20 $10 notes, crisp and real. Derek took them slowly, then looked at the screen. His account balance now read negative $160. He stood on that empty street corner, holding money that shouldn't exist, and felt his heart begin to pound. He knew with absolute certainty that his savings account had contained at most $40 that morning. He'd checked it obsessively, worried about an upcoming credit card payment. But here he was, holding $200 in cash, and the machine had simply allowed it. The system had failed. Or more accurately, the system had failed in a very specific, very exploitable way. What Derek did not know, what he couldn't have known, was that he'd accidentally discovered a vulnerability in the Commonwealth Bank's overnight processing system. During the hours between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m., the bank's ATM network entered what technicians call a batch processing mode, where machines operated on cached data rather than real-time account information. This was a legacy system, a relic from an earlier era of banking when computers were slower and data connections less reliable. The system was designed with a fail-safe. If an ATM couldn't verify an account balance in real time, it would default to allowing small withdrawals based on recent transaction history, assuming that most people wouldn't try to overdraft by large amounts in the middle of the night. It was a reasonable assumption under normal circumstances. What the system's architects hadn't anticipated was someone deliberately triggering this fail-safe and then exploiting it systematically. Derek returned to the pub, bought a round for his friends, and tried to forget about what had just happened. But at 2:30 in the morning, walking home alone, he found himself standing in front of the same ATM. The machine glowed in the darkness like a beacon. Just check, he told himself. Just see if it was a one-time error. He inserted his card and tried again. The transfer was rejected, but the withdrawal worked. Another $200 slid into his hands. Derek stood there, bills clutched in his fist, his alcohol-clouded brain suddenly sharp with a realization that would change everything. This wasn't a one-time glitch, this was repeatable. Over the next 72 hours, Derek Sullivan conducted what he would later describe as research. He tested the glitch methodically, like a scientist running experiments. He tried different amounts, $50, $100, $500. He tried different times, midnight, 1 a.m., 2:30 a.m., 4 a.m. He tried different ATMs across Sydney. The pattern became clear. The glitch only worked between 1 and 3 a.m. It only worked on withdrawals, never transfers. And it worked on every Commonwealth Bank ATM he tested. The system was broken in exactly the same way everywhere. Derek kept meticulous records. He saved every ATM receipt, noting the time, location, amount, and resulting balance. He photographed his bank statements. He created a spreadsheet tracking every transaction. Part of this was practical. He wanted to understand the glitch fully. But part of it was psychological. Even then, some part of him understood he was crossing a line he might need to document later. By the end of the first week, Derek had withdrawn $11,000. By the end of the second week, $23,000. He kept the cash in a locked box under his bed, counting it obsessively. Every morning he woke expecting the police to knock on his door. Every time his phone rang, his heart leapt into his throat. He checked his bank account constantly, waiting for it to be frozen or flagged or investigated. Nothing happened. His monthly statement arrived, showing all his withdrawals, but with no overdraft fees, no fraud alerts, no indication that anyone had noticed anything unusual. The bank's automated systems seemed completely blind to what was happening. Derek Sullivan quit his janitorial job in week 3, telling his supervisor he'd received an unexpected inheritance from a distant relative. It was a plausible lie, the kind of story that explained sudden wealth without raising too many questions. His co-workers were happy for him. On his last day, he tipped everyone $100, which seemed generous but not suspiciously so. With no job to tie him down, Derek began spending. He bought a new laptop, a large television, expensive clothes. He stayed in his small studio apartment. Moving would create a paper trail, but he transformed it into a space that no longer reflected the life of a minimum-wage worker. He started traveling. Paris first, staying in a 4-star hotel near the Louvre, eating at restaurants where he couldn't pronounce half the menu items, but where the food made him understand why people spent money on fine dining. Tokyo next, where he bought electronics and designer clothes and wandered through neighborhoods that felt like stepping into the future. Then Barcelona, Rome, Amsterdam, cities he'd only seen in movies, now real and tangible and his. The private jet was his most extravagant expense. $92,000 to charter a flight for himself and 3 close friends, Jake, Olivia, and his younger brother David, to Bali for a long weekend. They stayed at a luxury resort with private beaches and infinity pools, and Derek paid for everything with the casual confidence of someone who had unlimited resources. Because, in a sense, he did. His friends asked how a former janitor could afford this lifestyle. Derek told them he'd gotten into cryptocurrency early, made smart trades in Bitcoin, and cashed out at the right time. It was 2011. Bitcoin was just becoming mainstream enough that this lie felt plausible. Cryptocurrency was mysterious, volatile, and profitable for early adopters. His friends accepted the explanation with a mixture of envy and congratulations. To everyone else, hotel staff, flight attendants, restaurant servers, Derek claimed to work in real estate investment or international finance. He bought expensive business casual clothes and practiced walking with the confident stride of someone who belonged in luxury spaces. He became, outwardly, a different person. But internally, Derek Sullivan was falling apart. The paranoia that had started as a low hum in the back of his mind grew into a constant, consuming presence. Every single day began the same way. His eyes would snap open at dawn, and his first thought was always, "Is this the day they catch me?" He would lie there, heart racing, listening for sirens, for footsteps, for that inevitable knock on the door. Every phone call made his stomach drop. He would stare at the screen, seeing the bank's name or an unknown number, certain this was the moment they'd tell him they knew everything. But it never was. The bank called occasionally to confirm legitimate purchases, just checking that you really did charge $8,000 at a hotel in Paris, but nothing more. He couldn't sleep properly anymore. The nightmares had started in week 3 and only gotten worse. He dreamed of being chased through dark streets, of ATMs that swallowed his card and trapped him until police arrived, of courtrooms and prison cells and his parents' disappointed faces. During the day, he was constantly looking over his shoulder. He'd be sitting in a cafe in Melbourne or walking down a street in Sydney, and he'd see someone who might be watching him, a man in a suit lingering too long, a woman who seemed to be taking his picture, and panic would flood his system. Were they following him? Had the bank hired private investigators? Were federal agents building a case? He started changing his patterns constantly. Different ATMs every night, never the same one twice in a week. Different routes home. He paid for things in cash whenever possible to avoid creating digital trails. He used public computers at libraries to check his accounts, paranoid that his laptop was being monitored. His friends noticed something was wrong. "You seem jumpy, man," Jake had said during their Bali trip, watching Derek flinch at a loud noise by the pool. "You okay?" Derek had forced a smile. "Fine, just tired." But he wasn't fine. He thought about running. He could take $1 million in literal cash and disappear. There were countries with no extradition treaties, places where someone with money could vanish completely. He researched it obsessively. How to get fake identification, how to move money internationally without triggering alerts, which countries asked the fewest questions about wealthy foreigners, Southeast Asia, South America, parts of Eastern Europe. He could become Michael Thompson or James Wilson, someone anonymous and untraceable. But that scenario came with its own nightmare, life as a permanent fugitive, never seeing his family again, his parents in their small suburban house, his brother David, his childhood friends, never returning to Australia, to the beaches and cities he'd grown up in, constantly looking over his shoulder for the rest of his life, wondering if today would be the day someone recognized him, or Interpol came knocking. By month 4, Derek had withdrawn approximately 1.6 million Australian dollars. His cumulative total, according to the receipts he kept in a manila folder hidden in his closet, was $1,647,450. The number felt both abstract and terrifying. It was more money than his parents had earned in their combined lifetimes. It was enough to buy a house, multiple houses. It was also enough to send him to prison for the rest of his life. On a Tuesday morning in early November 2011, at 2:47 a.m., Derek Sullivan sat on his bed surrounded by stacks of cash and realized he couldn't do this anymore. The paranoia had become unbearable. He was sleeping 3, maybe 4 hours a night. He'd lost weight from stress. His hands shook when he approached ATMs. He'd started drinking more than he should, trying to quiet the constant anxiety in his head. The money had brought him incredible experiences, trips he'd never forget, the joy of helping people, the confidence that came with financial freedom. But it had also brought something else, constant, crushing, inescapable fear. At 3:15 a.m., Derek picked up his phone and dialed the Commonwealth Bank's 24-hour customer service line. His hands were shaking. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. "Commonwealth Bank, this is Trevor speaking. How can I help you?" Derek took a deep breath. "Hi, Trevor. My name is Derek Sullivan, and I need to report something. I've been exploiting a glitch in your ATM system for the past 4 months. I've withdrawn over $1.6 million that I don't actually have in my account." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I'm sorry, sir. Could you repeat that?" Derek did. He explained everything. The discovery of the glitch, the timing window between 1 and 3 a.m., how the transfer would cancel, but the withdrawal would work, how he'd been doing it nightly for months. His voice was steady, almost mechanical, like he was reciting facts from a police report. "I'm confessing," Derek said. "I know what I did was wrong. I'm ready to face the consequences. I can't keep doing this. I need it to be over." Another pause. "Sir, I'm going to need to transfer you to our fraud department. Please hold." Elevator music played for 7 minutes. Derek sat there, phone pressed to his ear, feeling a strange mix of terror and relief. This was it. This was finally it. "Mr. Sullivan, this is Amanda Rodriguez from our fraud investigation team. I understand you've just made some very serious claims about our ATM system." Derek repeated everything again. Amanda listened, asking occasional clarifying questions. She was professional, calm, taking notes, not expressing shock or anger or any emotion at all. "Mr. Sullivan, I want to be very clear with you. What you're describing is theft and fraud on a massive scale. This is a serious criminal matter. We will need to report this to the police, and you will almost certainly face charges. Do you understand?" "Yes," Derek said. "I understand. I'm ready for that." "All right. We'll be conducting an internal investigation and we'll be in contact with you soon. In the meantime, do not attempt to access any of your accounts or make any additional withdrawals. Do you understand?" "Yes. And Mr. Sullivan, you should probably get a lawyer." The call ended. Derek sat in the darkness of his apartment, waiting for relief to wash over him. It didn't come. Instead, he felt hollow, exhausted, like he'd just run a marathon. He'd confessed. He'd done the right thing. Now he just had to wait for the consequences. Days passed, then weeks, then months. Nothing happened. Derek waited for the police to contact him. He stayed in his apartment as much as possible, expecting them to show up any moment with handcuffs and arrest warrants. He checked his bank account obsessively and found that it had been frozen, which made sense. But no other action was taken. No detective called him, no lawyer reached out, no official correspondence arrived beyond a brief letter from the bank acknowledging that his accounts were under review pending investigation. Derek couldn't understand it. He'd confessed to stealing over $1 million, provided detailed records, offered to cooperate fully. How could everyone just not care? 6 months after his confession, Derek called the bank again. "Hi, yes. My name is Derek Sullivan. I called back in July about an ATM glitch. I was told the police would be contacting me, but..." He was transferred 3 times, each person seeming confused about his case, before finally reaching someone in the fraud department who pulled up his file. "Oh yes, Mr. Sullivan, we've documented your confession. As I understand it, the matter has been referred to the appropriate authorities." "But when will they contact me? It's been 6 months. I'm afraid I don't have that information, sir. You'll need to follow up with the police directly." But when Derek tried to follow up with the police, they had no record of any referral. No case had been opened. No investigation was underway. It was as if his confession had disappeared into some bureaucratic void. 1 year passed, then 2, then 3. By 2014, Derek Sullivan had been living in a strange limbo for 3 years. He'd spent or hidden most of the money, burned through on travel expenses, generous gifts, and the simple cost of living without working. His frozen bank accounts meant he couldn't access traditional banking, so he'd been living off cash and occasional under-the-table work. But no one had arrested him. No charges had been filed. The authorities had simply done nothing. The anxiety that had driven Derek to confess hadn't disappeared. If anything, it had gotten worse. He'd traded the specific fear of being caught for a more diffuse existential dread. He'd stolen over $1 million and gotten away with it. The universe had somehow failed to deliver justice, and that bothered him more than he could articulate. He started seeing a psychiatrist, Dr. Sarah Kim, a woman in her 50s who specialized in anxiety disorders and what she called moral injury. Over several months, Dr. Kim helped Derek understand that he was suffering from a complex mix of anxiety, guilt, and existential contamination. The feeling that he had fundamentally corrupted himself by crossing a moral line he could never uncross. The money itself isn't really the issue, Dr. Kim explained in one session. It's what the money represents. You've proven to yourself that you're capable of serious wrongdoing. You've discovered a part of yourself you didn't know existed, and you don't like what you found. So what do I do? Derek asked. Well, one option would be to make amends. You've already confessed to the bank, but perhaps you need a more public form of accountability, something that closes this chapter definitively. You mean like turning myself in? That's one possibility, or you could simply tell your story, not to hide, but to own what you did. Sometimes the path to healing requires radical honesty. Derek thought about that conversation for weeks. He'd already tried confessing privately. The bank hadn't cared. The police hadn't followed up. Maybe Dr. Kim was right. Maybe he needed to go public. In September 2014, Derek Sullivan did something that would either save him or destroy him. He went public with his story. He started by calling a journalist he'd found online, Emma Patterson, who wrote for the Sydney Morning Herald and specialized in financial crime stories. He told her everything, providing bank statements, ATM receipts, and a detailed timeline of his 4-month spree. Emma was skeptical at first. People made wild claims all the time, especially about banks and money, but the documentation Derek provided was too thorough to dismiss. This was real. Someone had actually found and exploited a massive security flaw in one of Australia's largest banks. Her article ran on page 3 of the newspaper under the headline, "Janitor steals $1.6 million through ATM glitch, bank failed to prosecute." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, Derek's phone was ringing constantly. Other journalists wanted interviews. Radio shows wanted him on air. A television producer reached out about a documentary. Derek said yes to almost all of it. He appeared on morning talk shows explaining the technical details of the glitch. He did podcast interviews discussing the psychological toll of his crime. He sat for a documentary interview talking about the money, the paranoia, and the guilt that had driven him to confess. Through it all, one thing remained constant. The police still didn't contact him. It was surreal. He was on television, in newspapers, openly admitting to massive fraud, and the authorities were completely silent, until someone decided they'd had enough. On October 12, 2014, Derek Sullivan was finally arrested. It didn't happen with the dramatic SWAT team raid he'd imagined for years. Instead, 2 plainclothes detectives knocked politely on his apartment door and asked him to come with them to the station. "Derek Sullivan, you're under arrest for fraud, theft, and unauthorized access to a computer system," one of them said, almost apologetically. "You have the right to remain silent." Derek had imagined this moment hundreds of times. He'd pictured himself panicking, running, breaking down. But when it actually happened, he felt only a strange, profound relief. "Okay," he said, "can I grab my jacket?" At the station, the detectives explained what had happened. After Derek's media appearances, a producer from one of the television shows had directly contacted the police, essentially turning him in. An investigation had been opened, and once they looked into it, the detectives discovered something surprising. The bank had never actually reported Derek to the police, despite telling him they would. The confession he'd made 3 years earlier had been documented internally, then seemingly forgotten or ignored. No formal complaint had been filed. No referral had been made. It was only now, after Derek had gone public and forced the issue, that authorities were taking action. "If you'd just kept your mouth shut and stayed off TV," one of the detectives said, shaking his head, "we probably never would have known about any of this." Derek sat in the interrogation room, and for the first time in 3 years he laughed. He'd gotten away with it, completely gotten away with it. And then he'd worked so hard to get caught that he'd essentially had to turn himself in on national television before anyone bothered to arrest him. The trial, when it finally happened, was strange from beginning to end. Derek hired a lawyer, a public defender named Rachel Torres, who specialized in financial crimes. She reviewed the evidence and had one consistent reaction: confusion. "I don't understand how you did this," she said, looking at the technical details. "I mean, I understand what you did, but I don't understand how it worked. How did the bank not notice? How did their systems allow this for 4 months?" The prosecution had the same problem. The prosecutor, a serious man named Jeffrey Hammond, brought in bank technical experts to explain the glitch. They couldn't. They brought in Commonwealth Bank's head of security, who admitted under oath that they still weren't entirely sure how Derek had exploited their system. "We've patched the vulnerability," the security director testified. "But I'll be honest, we discovered the patch more through trial and error than through understanding the root cause. Mr. Sullivan somehow found a flaw in our overnight processing that our entire security team had missed." The judge, a woman in her 60s named Justice Patricia Morrison, listened to all of this with growing incredulity. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," she said during one hearing. "The defendant walked up to an ATM, found a glitch, exploited it for 4 months, withdrew $1.6 million, then called the bank and confessed. The bank told him he'd face serious consequences, then did nothing. 3 years later, the defendant went on television to talk about his crime, at which point he was finally arrested. And now, in this courtroom, neither the prosecution nor the bank can fully explain how any of this was technically possible." "Is that accurate?" "Yes, Your Honor," Jeffrey Hammond admitted. "This is perhaps the strangest case I've encountered in 20 years on the bench," Justice Morrison said. The trial itself was brief. Derek pleaded guilty. There was no point in fighting it, and honestly, he wanted the closure. The question became one of sentencing. The prosecution argued for significant prison time, 10 years given the amount stolen, but they struggled to make the case compelling. Derek had confessed voluntarily. He'd gone public voluntarily. He'd essentially turned himself in. He'd spent or lost most of the money, meaning there was nothing to recover. And most importantly, the bank's own negligence had made the crime possible in the first place. Rachel Torres argued for leniency. "Your Honor, my client discovered a flaw that a major financial institution had missed. Yes, he exploited it illegally, but he also exposed a massive security vulnerability that could have been found and used by someone far more dangerous: organized crime, international hackers, terrorist organizations. In a strange way, Mr. Sullivan's crime made the banking system safer." It was a stretch, but Justice Morrison seemed sympathetic. "Mr. Sullivan," the judge said during sentencing, "what you did was wrong. Theft is theft, regardless of how you accomplished it. However, I'm also mindful of several mitigating factors: your voluntary confession, your clear remorse, the bank's failure to prosecute you despite your admission, and the bizarre circumstances of this entire case. I'm sentencing you to 1 year in prison, followed by 3 years of probation and community service. I'm also ordering you to pay restitution to the bank in the amount of, well, whatever you're capable of paying, which I suspect is very little. 1 year for stealing $1.6 million. In the courtroom, Derek Sullivan felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. Prison was exactly as uncomfortable and dehumanizing as Derek had feared, but it was also, strangely, a relief. He was sent to a minimum security facility in Western Sydney, the kind of place for white-collar criminals and non-violent offenders. He shared a cell with a man named Trevor, who'd been convicted of tax fraud and spent his days working in the prison library and attending mandatory rehabilitation programs. The other inmates found his story fascinating. He was the ATM guy, a minor celebrity among a population that appreciated creative approaches to crime. "You just walked up to a machine and took money," a man named Tony asked him during lunch one day. Tony was serving time for armed robbery. "That's it? No weapons, no threats, no crew?" "That's it," Derek confirmed. "Man," Tony said, shaking his head, "I'm in the wrong business." But what surprised Derek most about prison was how much his anxiety decreased. For the first time in years, he knew exactly where he stood. He was paying his debt to society. He had a defined end date. When he got out, this would be behind him. The nightmares stopped. The constant vigilance faded. He slept properly for the first time since 2011. He wrote in a journal every day, partly as therapy, partly as a record of his thoughts. He wrote about the discovery of the glitch, the escalation, the paranoia, the guilt. He wrote about what he'd learned about himself, that he was capable of both remarkable creativity and serious moral failure, that money couldn't actually buy happiness if it came with constant fear, that confession really was good for the soul even if it took years to get anyone to listen. Dr. Kim came to visit him once a month. "How are you doing?" she'd ask. "Better," Derek would say, and he meant it. "This is where I need to be." His family visited too. His parents were disappointed but supportive. His brother David brought him books and told him about his life outside. His friends Jake and Olivia came once, awkward and uncertain how to act around their incarcerated friend, but trying their best. Derek served his full year without incident. He was released in October 2015, 4 years after his original discovery of the glitch, to a world that had mostly moved on from his story. Life after prison was harder than Derek had anticipated. He was a convicted felon now, which meant employment options were limited. No bank would hire him, obviously. Most retail establishments were wary. He ended up working at a warehouse, loading trucks and moving boxes for minimum wage. He lived in a small apartment in a less expensive suburb, taking public transit to work, living a life that looked almost exactly like his pre-glitch existence. Except now, he had a criminal record and a story that followed him everywhere. The 3 years of probation meant regular check-ins with a probation officer, random drug tests, and restrictions on his travel. He paid a small amount of restitution to the bank each month, $50, all he could afford, toward a debt that would take him literally centuries to repay at that rate. But he was also, for the first time in years, genuinely okay. The guilt that had consumed him had finally eased. He'd confessed, been punished, and served his time. The chapter was closed. He could move forward now without constantly looking over his shoulder. He dated occasionally, though explaining his criminal past to new partners was always awkward. He reconnected with old friends and made new ones who knew his story and didn't judge him for it. He eventually found work as a facilities manager at a small office building. Not quite back to janitorial work, but close enough that he appreciated the irony. In 2017, Derek was approached by a journalist working on a book about financial crimes. She wanted to include his story. Derek agreed, under the condition that he could review anything written about him for accuracy. The book came out in 2018, Digital Heists, Modern Banking Crimes and the People Who Commit Them. Derek's chapter was titled The Accidental Thief. It was fair and thorough, portraying him as neither hero nor villain, but as a complex person who'd made a terrible decision and paid for it. Occasionally, someone would recognize him. "Wait, aren't you that guy from the ATM thing?" And he'd nod and confirm it, waiting to see if they'd judge him or congratulate him or just be curious. The reactions varied. One detail that fascinated people about Derek's story was the bank's response or lack thereof. The Commonwealth Bank had never publicly acknowledged the glitch. They'd patched it quietly after Derek's confession, but they'd never issued a statement, never warned customers, never explained how it had happened or how they'd fixed it. When journalists asked about it after Derek's trial, the bank's response was always the same. "We take security very seriously and continuously update our systems to protect our customers. We cannot comment on specific security measures." In 2016, a technology reporter named James Fitzgerald did an in-depth investigation into banking security and discovered something remarkable. Derek Sullivan hadn't been the only person to exploit this particular glitch. Through Freedom of Information requests and interviews with former bank employees, Fitzgerald uncovered evidence that at least 3 other people had discovered, and used similar ATM exploits at various Australian banks between 2009 and 2012. The amount stolen ranged from $50,000 to $300,000. None of them had been prosecuted. The banks had caught the discrepancies during internal audits, frozen the accounts, quietly recovered what money they could, and then done nothing. No police reports, no public disclosures, just patches to their systems and internal memos about improving security protocols. Why? According to Fitzgerald's sources, the banks were terrified of public disclosure. If customers knew that ATMs could be exploited this easily, confidence in the banking system would plummet. If other criminals knew the vulnerabilities existed, they might reverse engineer the exploits and cause widespread damage. So the banks had chosen to handle these incidents quietly, accepting the losses as the cost of maintaining public confidence. Derek Sullivan had been prosecuted not because his crime was worse than the others, but because he'd gone public. He'd forced the issue. He'd made it impossible for the bank to quietly sweep it under the rug. In a weird way, Fitzgerald wrote in his article, Derek Sullivan was punished not for stealing $1.6 million, but for talking about it. The article sparked outrage and calls for banking reform. Parliamentary committees held hearings. The Australian Securities and Investments Commission launched an investigation into whether banks were required to disclose security breaches. But ultimately, little changed. Banks tightened their security, regulations were tweaked slightly, and the story faded from public consciousness, as stories always do. One unexpected consequence of Derek's public confession was that other people who'd exploited similar glitches began reaching out to him. An email arrived in 2016 from a woman named Janitor, who'd discovered a different banking glitch in 2008 that allowed her to withdraw from her mortgage account as if it were a savings account. She'd taken $180,000 before the bank caught the error. They sent me a letter threatening legal action, Janitor wrote, but then nothing ever happened. They just corrected my account balance and moved on. I've been living with the guilt for 8 years and I don't know what to do. Derek met her at a cafe in Melbourne. She was in her 40s, a former accountant, and she looked exhausted in a way Derek recognized immediately. Do you think I should confess? She asked him. Derek thought about his own experience, the 3 years of waiting, the media circus, the trial, the prison time. Honestly, I don't know, he said. In my case, confessing helped me psychologically, but it also destroyed my career and put me in prison. Only you can decide if that trade-off is worth it. But how do you live with it otherwise? Janitor asked. How do you just carry it around? Therapy, Derek said. Lots of therapy, and maybe finding ways to make amends that don't involve prison. Donate to charity, volunteer, help people. It won't erase what you did, but it might help you live with yourself. They stayed in touch. Jennifer never confessed publicly, but she did begin volunteering at a financial literacy nonprofit, teaching people about banking and helping them avoid predatory loans. It was her way of balancing the scales. Another person who reached out was a man named Raj, who'd exploited a different glitch in 2013 involving cryptocurrency exchanges and delays in processing withdrawals. He'd made $400,000 before the exchange shut him down. I keep expecting them to sue me or have me arrested, Raj said during their phone conversation. But it's been 3 years and nothing. I can't sleep. I can't focus. I feel like I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop. Yeah, Derek said. I know that feeling intimately. Listen, I'm not going to tell you what to do with your life, but I can tell you that the waiting, the constant anxiety, that might be worse than actually facing consequences. At least consequences have an end date. These conversations continued over the years. Derek became an unofficial support system for people who'd committed financial crimes and were struggling with the psychological aftermath. He wasn't a therapist, and he didn't pretend to have all the answers, but he understood what they were going through in a way most people couldn't. In 2019, Derek started a small anonymous online support group for people dealing with guilt over past crimes. It wasn't about helping people evade justice. Several members had already served their sentences, but about processing the emotional weight of having crossed moral lines they couldn't uncross. The group met virtually once a month. Sometimes they discussed practical matters like rebuilding after prison or managing probation requirements. More often, They talked about guilt, shame, self-forgiveness, and how to move forward when you couldn't undo your past. "I used to think I was a good person," one member said during a meeting. "Now I know I'm capable of doing bad things. How do I reconcile that?" "Maybe you're both," Derek replied. "Maybe we all are. Good people who sometimes do bad things, bad people who sometimes do good things. The categories aren't as clean as we'd like them to be." It was through this group that Derek met Claire, a woman who'd been convicted of embezzlement from her employer. She'd served 2 years in prison and was now rebuilding her life as a bookkeeper for small businesses, the only ones willing to hire someone with her record. They started dating in late 2019. She understood his past in a way previous partners hadn't. There was no judgment, no shocked reaction when he told her about the ATM glitch, just recognition from someone who'd walked a similar path. "Do you regret it?" she asked him one night over dinner. Derek thought about it. "I regret the stress, the paranoia, the damage to my family, but I don't regret the trip to Paris, or the money I gave to homeless people, or even going to prison, because prison is what finally gave me peace. So it's complicated." "Everything's complicated," Claire said, smiling. "That's what makes us human." By 2020, nearly a decade after his discovery of the glitch, Derek Sullivan had built something resembling a normal life. He had a job he didn't hate, an apartment he could afford, a partner who understood him, and a group of friends who knew his full story and accepted him anyway. He still paid $50 a month in restitution to the bank. At that rate, he'd be making payments for the next 266 years. The absurdity of it made him laugh sometimes. His probation had ended in 2018, which meant he could travel again. He and Claire took a trip to New Zealand, his first international travel since his release from prison. Standing on a beach in Auckland watching the sunset, Derek felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Contentment. Not happiness exactly. Not the manic euphoria he'd felt during those first weeks with infinite money, but a quieter, more sustainable sense of being okay with where he was and who he'd become. "You're thinking about it, aren't you?" Claire said, noticing his distant expression. "How can you tell?" "You get this look like you're somewhere else." Derek nodded. "I was just thinking about that night, the first time I found the glitch. If I could go back and talk to that drunk 29-year-old janitor standing at the ATM, what would I tell him? Don't do it. Maybe or maybe just be prepared for everything that comes after, the good, the bad, all of it." "Do you think he'd listen?" Derek laughed. "Probably not. Would you have listened at 29? "Fair point." They stood there in silence for a while, watching the waves roll in. "You know what's weird?" Derek said. "I stole $1.6 million, and I ended up right back where I started. Working a normal job, living in a small apartment, struggling to make rent sometimes. It's like the universe hit a reset button. Except you're not the same person," Claire pointed out. "You've traveled the world. You've faced your worst fears. You've been to prison and come out the other side. That changes you. Is that a good thing? I don't know, is it?" Derek thought about that question for a long time. Was he better off having discovered the glitch? Having lived through 4 months of incredible luxury, followed by years of crushing anxiety, followed by prison, followed by this slow, patient rebuilding of a life. The old Derek, the one who'd worked night shifts cleaning office bathrooms and dreamed of a different life, would probably say yes. The adventure alone would have seemed worth it. The current Derek, standing on a beach in New Zealand with a criminal record and a debt he'd never fully repay, wasn't so sure. But he was here. He was alive. He was okay. And maybe, after everything, that was enough. The story of Derek Sullivan and the ATM glitch raises questions that extend far beyond one man's crime. It exposes the fragility of the digital systems we trust with our entire financial lives. It reveals how institutions sometimes prioritize reputation over accountability. It demonstrates the psychological complexity of guilt and the human need for consequences, even when those consequences mean imprisonment. In the year since Derek's case, banking security has improved, but vulnerabilities still exist. Every system has flaws, every code has bugs, and somewhere right now someone might be discovering the next infinite money glitch, standing at an ATM, seeing an error message and making the same choice Derek made on that July night in 2011. The difference is what they do next. Derek Sullivan's legacy isn't the money he stole. It's the conversation he started about transparency, accountability, and the strange reality that sometimes the hardest thing to do is not committing a crime. It's confessing to one. Today, Derek lives quietly in Sydney. He works, pays his bills, and occasionally speaks to students studying criminal justice or computer security about his experience. He doesn't glorify what he did, but he doesn't hide from it either. When people ask if he'd do it all again, his answer is always the same. I don't know. Ask me in another 10 years. Because the truth is, we never really know who we are until we're tested. We never know what lines we're capable of crossing until we find ourselves standing at that threshold, drunk and tired and holding money that shouldn't exist, deciding whether to walk away or take one more step into the darkness. Derek Sullivan took that step, and for the rest of his life, he'll be living with the consequences, not just the legal ones, but the internal ones. The knowledge that he's capable of both remarkable audacity and profound weakness, that he found a glitch in the system and couldn't resist exploiting it, that he got away with it and then couldn't live with getting away with it. That's the real story, not the money, not the glitch. But the man who discovered that sometimes the prison we build in our own minds is harsher than any cell constructed of concrete and steel, and sometimes the only way to escape that prison is to confess, even if it takes 3 years and a national media tour for anyone to listen.